So anyway, to go back to my story, I was very curious about the information he gave, because he talked about how the numbers were really going down in the Cascades because of lack of genetic diversity and other adverse conditions that were being experienced. And since then, there's been this very large translocation program from Olympic National Park, excuse me. And so I thought it'd be great to have him back and talk about what is going on with this, the translocation of these mountain goats, and what is going to be happening in the future with the mountain goats in the Cascades. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. David Wallin, and I hope everybody enjoys the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's hard to believe it's been 9 years, but I guess it has been since I last talked to you folks about the work that I've done on mountain goats. I've worked on a lot of different species over the years, including quite a bit of work in past years on birds. But the work that I'll talk about today is work that I've been involved in over the last 15 years on mountain goats in the Cascades. And I think I'll start by sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that now. So there you see my contact information. As Stephen said, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Western. Been there now it's been 25 years. I believe it's been that long. And of course, I realize I'm speaking to the Audubon Society, and you're mostly interested in things that fly. But I think that goats do count for, oops, let's see here. I'm having problems with my advance button. Bear with me for a minute. There we go. So yes, mountain goats do fly. And this is sort of a preface to the work that I'll get to towards the end of this talk, and the work that Stephen alluded to, and that is our efforts to translocate goats from Olympic National Park to the Cascades. And I'll get to that a little bit later. I want to point out that all of the work that I've done has involved collaborating with a wide variety of people, a variety of organizations, a number of different Indian tribes, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Forest Service, the Park Service, USGS. Also work with folks up in Canada, British Columbia, and University of Alberta. Kelly McAllister at the Department of Transportation. As I said, a number of different Indian tribes have been invaluable in this work. And in fact, I got involved in working on mountain goats as a result of a phone call that I received from Doug McMurtry, who at the time worked for the Soxhawtl Indian tribe. And somebody who worked for him, actually one of our former students, called me up and told me that the Soxhawtl tribe is an upriver tribe, very connected to the mountains, and the mountain goats are very important to them for cultural and historic reasons. Told me that mountain goat populations were way down, and wondered if I would be interested in getting involved in working with them to try and solve this, address this issue. And at the time, I knew nothing about goats, but what I did know about them is that they live up in the alpine zone, and most wildlife populations that I've dealt with that are in decline, in most cases, it's largely a result of habitat destruction. And so I was kind of curious as to how mountain goats could possibly be experiencing a decline. And so I got involved in it, and it's turned out to be one of the longest running projects that I've had over the course of my career. I've been fortunate to have 5 excellent grad students work with me over the years on master's thesis projects dealing with mountain goats. You see them listed here. Also able to get a large number of undergraduates involved in the work as well now. Something in excess of 50 undergrads have worked on this project over the years. So mountain goats are really very much an icon and symbolic of wild, rugged habitat. And mountain goats have been adopted as an icon for everything from the Great Northern Railroad to microbrew deer. And everything in between. So they're a very popular species, one that's been embraced by a wide variety of organizations. Mountain goats, as you may or may not know, have a very wide distribution here in North America. Most of the mountain goats that exist on the planet are found in British Columbia, to some extent Alberta, and also up into southeast Alaska. And down here in the Cascades in Washington State, this is really very much the southern extent of the range, although there are some goats that, that extend down into Idaho and Montana as well. So just some general characteristics of mountain goats. If you're at close range and you have a good spotting scope, you can distinguish between the sexes largely on the basis of the shape of the horns. You'll see here that for adult females, that the horns tend to initially go more or less straight up and then curve only at the tip. With males, with billies, you'll see that the curve is more or less a continuous curve all the way from the base to the tip. Also notice that from looking from the front, horns are more widely spaced with billies than they are with nannies. So again, after you've looked at mountain goats for a long time, and if you're at close range, based on the shape of the horns, you can distinguish between the sexes. Lifespan, goats can live for 10 to 14 years, sexually mature at age 3. Both sexes have horns, as I said. Adult males, 150 to 250 pounds. We had some goats that we translocated that were in excess, big billies that were in excess of 300 pounds, so they can get quite large. Females a bit smaller. And if you're out in the mountains and you see a group of mountain goats, it's almost always going to be, I would say always, going to be a group that's dominated by a number of adult females and their offspring. And the males will stay with this nanny group up until the age of about 2, and then the males go off by themselves. And the males tend to be solitary throughout the year, except during the rut, which is in the fall. So if you see a group of goats, it's virtually always a nanny group with adult females and their offspring. Now their female offspring will tend to stay with that group and eventually become the adult females in that group. Mountain goats are, of course, renowned for their mountain climbing abilities. Mountain goats spend a lot of their time hanging out, literally, on precipitous cliffs, what we refer to as escape terrain. And this photograph on the right, that's not a doctored photograph, that's a real photograph of a mountain goat on precipitous terrain. Now, mountain goats hang out on this escape terrain to, guess what, escape. Primary predators here in the Cascades in Washington would be cougars, and cougars take a fair number of mountain goats. Up in Alaska, grizzlies are also an important predator on goats, and this is a photograph taken by one of my former graduates with a not very long lens. This photograph taken up in Alberta, and this photograph goat in the foreground, and my graduate student survived. But grizzly bears are also a very important predator on mountain goats. Bit about the status of mountain goats. As I said, most of the population of mountain goats that exist in the world are found in Canada and Southeast Alaska. Smaller numbers here in the lower 48. Historically, the Washington Cascades had about 10,000 goats, but more recently, from about the late 1980s onward, population has been much reduced, and the most recent estimates are in the neighborhood of 3,000 to maybe 3,500 goats. And so this was the motivation for our initial efforts to get involved with mountain goats and try and figure out why mountain goat populations have declined. And I really put virtually all the credit on this to the Soxhawtl tribe. They're the group that really drew attention to this big decline and really pushed the state and other state agencies and federal agencies to get involved in trying to figure out why populations were so low and what could be done to restore the populations. And to make a long story short, we are virtually, well, we're very, very confident that the reason for the decline was simply overhunting. And when the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife first got involved in managing mountain goat populations back in the 40s and 50s, they didn't really know very much about mountain goat biology, but they did know a lot about managing other ungulate populations for hunting. And so they made what at the time was a very reasonable assumption. And they said, well, we don't know much about goats, but we know a lot about managing other ungulate populations for hunting. So let's just assume that mountain goats are kind of like other ungulates, in particular deer. That wasn't a bad place to start, but it turned out to be a bad assumption for a number of reasons. And backing up for a minute, with deer, it was widely known that deer populations could withstand a mortality rate, a hunting-based mortality rate of about 4% per year. That is, you could kill about 4% of the population per year without having any impact on population size. And so that was the initial harvest rate that the state managed for. Now, that turned out to be a bad decision for two reasons. The first was sort of a forgivable mistake. Again, didn't know much about goats, but it turns out that mountain goats have much lower survival rates and much lower reproductive rates than is the case for deer. Again, that was a forgivable mistake. The other mistake, which should have been anticipated, and that is that with deer, only the males have antlers. So you can tell the hunters to only shoot the animals with the pointy things coming out of their heads. And that limits the hunter-based mortality to just males. And it turns out you can kill a lot of males without having an impact on the population. But as I indicated earlier, both male and female mountain goats have horns, and it's very, very difficult to distinguish between males and females in the field. Yes, at close range with a spotting scope, you can do it, but it takes a lot of experience and you have to be very, very close. And so not surprisingly, hunters made a lot of mistakes, even though they were encouraged to only take males. It turns out about half the animals that were killed by hunters were females. And killing females has a much bigger impact on the population. And so largely for those two reasons, didn't realize that the survival rate, mortality rates were much lower, and also because the hunter-based mortality hit the females very, very hard. That's what caused this precipitous decline, really starting in the 1960s, but really accelerating dramatically in the 70s and 80s. And so by the late 1980s, the agency realized that they had problems, and they almost shut off the hunt. Not entirely. There still are about somewhere between a dozen to maybe 15 or 18 permits that are issued per year in the state. It's a lottery system. It's a once in a lifetime. It costs $10 to put your name in the hat. And if you get a tag, that's your once in a lifetime opportunity. And the state gets about 10,000 people a year who enter that lottery. So by keeping the hunt open, the agency gets about $100,000 a year in revenue, which basically pays for a biologist. So there's a lot of motivation to keep the hunt open a little bit. But so from about 1990 on, so for nearly 30 years, there's been almost no hunting of mountain goats in the Cascades. But much to our surprise, the populations haven't really recovered very much, except in a handful of places, Mount Baker being one of the healthiest populations in the state. As you can see from this figure here, all the little black dots are places where at some point in the past, from the 1940s onward, somebody, a hunter, harvested a mountain goat. So you can see that the distribution of hunter harvest was throughout the Cascades. And these colored polygons show you where there are still pockets of mountain goats in Washington state. And you can see there are large areas that historically had goats that don't really have any or very many goats today. So again, we're pretty confident the decline is the result of overhunting. And so why is that? Well, This is a series of figures that was put together by one of my first grad students, Andrew Shirk. And, you know, again, when I got into this over 15 years ago, what little I knew about mountain goats was that, you know, most of the alpine zone is protected in one way or another. So what could possibly be a problem? How could there's not really any significant habitat loss. But what this series of figures point out is that, well, okay, here's the big cities, but again, that's down at low elevations. That shouldn't really have an impact. You add in the major roads, and yeah, there are 4 major highways going across the Cascades, but still things don't look too bad. Then you add in the secondary roads. Okay, still most of those roads are at lower elevation. But then you add in all of the logging roads, the little bitty logging roads, and there's a whole lot of red on that map. And now here's the current pockets, the places where we still have populations of mountain goats. And you begin to get the idea that maybe that alpine habitat is a bit more fragmented than you might initially think. Well, as I said, over the last 15 years, we've done a lot of work on goats. As I said, I had 5 graduate students who've done thesis projects on goats. Some of the first work that we did was habitat modeling, and Adam Wells and Tana Buse focused on that. Cliff Rice, Dr. Cliff Rice, who is now retired, but he is a biologist who worked for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He helped to develop some better census methods for mountain goats. Had 2 graduate students, Andrew Shirk and Leslie Parks, did work on the genetics of mountain goats in the Cascades. And then my most recent student, Melissa Oscarson, did some population modeling work. And as Stephen indicated, the focus over the last few years has been on translocation and restoration efforts. And I'll get to that towards the end. And there have been a large number of people who've helped out on the translocation work. So as I said, initially our focus was on trying to understand habitat in the Cascades. And for that work, we started using these GPS radio tags. These are really remarkable piece of equipment. There's a battery on here. The entire collar weighs about 2 pounds, which for a mountain goat is not a significant load. These collars are remarkable in that they can operate, in theory, they should be able to last for 2 to 3 years. And the way they work is we program them to turn on the GPS receiver periodically every 3 or 4 hours. The GPS receiver then attempts to obtain a fix, a position. It then stores that location in the collar and then shuts down to save battery power. There's also a beacon transmitter that we can locate with a VHF receiver and a directional antenna. We can then either fly over in an aircraft and ping the collar and instruct the collar to transmit all of its data that it's been logging over the last few months up to us in the aircraft, or we can send somebody out on the ground to do the same thing, to download the data. So we get this remarkable data set on habitat use and survivorship. Initially, this initial round of work, we really tagged about 60 mountain goats throughout the Cascades. So we've got literally millions of positions on these goats over a several-year period. Then, as I said, Cliff Rice developed what's known as a siteability bias model to obtain better estimates of population size. The problem is that when you fly over in a helicopter and to count mountain goats, you don't see all the goats that are there because some of them, hide under the trees or under bushes when the helicopter's going over. So you don't see all the animals. And so we did a bunch of work under Cliff's direction to help develop this siteability bias model to give us better population estimates. And then this is a figure that my grad student Andrew Shirk put together that I think does a nice job of laying out the factors that can influence population viability. So obviously harvest levels, the number of goats killed by hunters, has an impact on population size. But as I've already alluded to, habitat fragmentation probably also has an impact on population viability. Both of these factors influence what's known as effective local population size. And effective local population size is not the same as the census size. It's the number of individuals in census, the number of individuals that are out there that actually contribute to reproduction. So, okay, initially you say, well, okay, you don't count the immature animals, just the animals that are reproductively mature. But it also turns out that in mountain goats, as with many other ungulates, only a very, very small proportion of the adult males in the population actually successfully reproduce. A really intensive study that was done by some of our collaborators up in Alberta, they've got this population of a couple hundred goats that they've followed for 15, 20 years. Every animal's marked. They have really, really detailed information on every individual. And in that population of 200 or 300 goats, there's only about 3 or 4 males that are responsible for siring about 90% of the kids in that population. So most of the adult males don't contribute to reproduction. So you can see that the effective local population size is going to be quite a bit smaller than the census size. And the effective local population size then has an impact on genetic diversity. Genetic diversity influences both the long-term evolutionary potential, but it also influences the effective local population size, because reduced genetic diversity, leads to a reduction in fitness, which leads to a reduction in the effective local population size. Now, what evidence do we have to indicate that genetic diversity really is going to influence the fitness, the survival rate? Well, here's some data from, again, our collaborators up in Alberta, a PhD student up there by the name of Mangui, French-Canadian, again, working in that Carl Ridge population in Alberta, that intensively studied population. They had genetic data for every individual in the population. And here, this genetic diversity here is indicated by heterozygosity. This is just one of many possible measures of genetic diversity. So here's genetic diversity, and here's juvenile survival. And what you can see here from these data is that, yeah, it sure looks pretty convincing that higher levels of genetic diversity lead to higher levels of juvenile survival. And if you look at the genetic diversity in that population of mountain goats up in Canada, the average genetic diversity, or excuse me, average heterozygosity here is about 0.55, which gives you a juvenile survival rate of about 85%. Turns out in the Washington Cascades, work by my graduate students indicate that the average heterozygosity is more like 0.37, which gives you a juvenile survival rate considerably lower at around 73%. So right away, here's some fairly compelling evidence to indicate that genetic diversity is going to have an influence on survival. And we think this is one of the factors which has caused this population to not recover as quickly as we might like, in spite of the dramatically reduced harvest levels by hunters. So the first bit of genetic work that was done, that we did here, again, this is my graduate student, Andrew Shirk. He focused his work on the Cascades. He did have a few samples from the Olympics, and I'll talk about the Olympics a little bit more later. But suffice to say that the Olympic population is a non-native population that was introduced in the 1920s based on 11 or 12 animals that were captured up in Southeast Alaska and in the Canadian Rockies, brought down and released. And so we had a lot of reason to believe that the genetic characteristics of these goats in the Olympics would be somewhat different than genetic characteristics of goats in the Cascades. And so this shows the location of all the samples that Andrew had from his work. His samples came partially from all those goats that we radio tagged. There were also a handful of hunter-killed animals for which we had genetic data, a handful of animals that just showed up dead, and we got samples from them. And Andrew also went out and did what's known as biopsy darting. And this involves, this is one of the darts that he used. There's basically an air rifle with a CO2 charge in it. fires this dart that has what's kind of like a paper punch. It's a round tube that's about, well, it's about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, inside diameter, very sharp on the rim, and there's a little barb on the inside. So you got to sneak up on the goats and get within about 20 or 30 yards of them. And then you shoot them in the butt with a biopsy dart, and the dart bounces out and you get a little tissue sample. And the goats barely even flinch. They just sort of act like they got stung by a bee and go back to grazing. And so in some cases he was able to shoot, it's not like they run away. Oftentimes he was able to dart, 2 or 3 animals in one group. And then he'd have to sort of shoo them away so he could retrieve the darts. So anyway, he ended up with 149 samples from the Cascades, a few samples from Olympic National Park. And from these samples, we were able to genotype these animals. And we could look at the degree of relatedness between these animals. And so, if you have 2 animals that are some distant, 2 samples that were collected some distance apart, maybe 20 or 30 kilometers, we can use that genetic data to determine what's known as genetic distance as a way of quantifying how related these animals are. Not that they're siblings or anything like that, but you can imagine that if there's a lot of movement of animals between those 2 locations, there's going to be interbreeding, and those populations in locations tens of kilometers apart are likely to be pretty similar. On the other hand, if there's some sort of a barrier that prevents the movement of animals between 2 locations, the populations in those locations are likely to be genetically very distinct. So that was the basic idea that we were trying to pursue, and skipping a whole lot of the details. Much to our surprise, we went into this with no real preconceived notion about, what factors might influence movement of goats in the Cascades. Oh, and I should back up a little bit and say, from all those animals we radio tagged, we thought we'd get a lot of information about movement, but it turns out radio tags are really not, they're a good way to get information about day-to-day movement of animals, but not a good way to get good information about dispersal. And the reason for that is that dispersal is a rare event. And more often than not, dispersal ends badly in the sense that an animal dispersing through unfamiliar terrain gets picked off by a mountain goat, or gets hit by a car, or ends up in a place where there aren't any other goats and it doesn't reproduce. So we quickly discovered that radio tags are not a good way to get information about movement. But this genetic data is a great way to get that information, because the genetic characteristics of a population really archive the movement and interbreeding that's been happening for this population over a period of many, many years, many, many generations. So it's a much better way to get at this issue of connectivity. And skipping a whole lot of the computational details, this was our big, quite surprising result that came out of Andrew's work. And what we found is that the animals in the North Cascades were genetically pretty similar to one another, and quite different than the animals in the South Cascades. This figure really shows, you think of it as sort of like a topographic map, but what it's really showing you is genetic characteristics. In this case, it's showing you the probability of encountering a goat that's part of this, that's a member, if you will, of this North Cascades population. And you can see the probability of encountering a North Cascades, a goat with North Cascades genetic characteristics, not surprisingly, is quite high in the North Cascades, but that probability changes very, very rapidly along this front right here. And it turns out that this place where genetic characteristics change very, very rapidly, much to our surprise, that aligns very, very well with this dark line, and this dark line is the location of the I-90 corridor. So it indicated pretty clearly that the I-90 corridor is not an absolute barrier to the movement of goats, but it's a pretty strong impediment such that we have this very pronounced genetic discontinuity here. So that was quite surprising. And we don't know, is it the road itself, or is it the habitat alterations that are associated with the road? Maybe, location of buildings and other human structures, human activities, could also be habitat alterations associated with the road. We're not sure. One of the other, actually, I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time. It turns out many of you might be familiar with, oh, and I guess maybe I could pause there and ask if there are any questions. Stephen, or did you get any questions coming in over the chat?
Well, so far we don't have any questions.
Okay.
The only comment is we have some background noise. It sounds like someone's typing on a keyboard. I don't know if that's you or someone else, but
yes, actually, my wife is working in the room and she's typing on a keyboard here.
Okay, because we can hear that quite well in the background, and so that's a bunch of panelists were making comments that it was sort of a little bit disruptive.
Okay. I'll see what we can do about that. Okay. My wife says she won't type for a while, so maybe that'll help. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we don't have any questions. We don't have any questions so far.
Okay.
I'm sure we will have some.
Okay. Well, as many of you may know, there's been a big effort to do some work on the I-90 corridor, and it's been recognized for a long time, even before we had our results for mountain goats, that the I-90 corridor was probably a barrier to movement of all kinds of wildlife, mountain goats and other species as well. And so there was interest in doing some upgrades to the highway. And in the process of while they were doing these upgrades to the highway highway department also committed to creating a bunch of wildlife crossing structures. And this work's been underway for the last few years. They're just about wrapping it up. One of the projects involved taking a bridge over Gold Creek, which is just over on the east side. It's starting to go down on the east side of the Cascades. Originally, there was just a really small bridge over the creek that I think was 50 or 60 feet long, and they replaced that with a bridge that was nearly 1,000 feet long and provides extensive opportunities for animals to cross underneath the highway. There's also a big wildlife overpass that's being constructed that will allow wildlife to move over the highway. There's also been a number of smaller structures for more diminutive creatures, small culverts and so forth. And there's been a lot of effort to document that, these crossing structures are being extensively used. So we're anxious to see how the work on the I-90 to provide these crossing structures across I-90 might improve the movement of wildlife across this highway. Now, following up on Andrew's work,
David, I have a quick question. So,
sure.
have you seen any mountain goats? I know they've got wildlife cams on some of these.
Yeah, they have wildlife cams on some of these structures, and to the best of my knowledge, they haven't seen any mountain goats, but they've seen a lot of other wildlife. Mule deer and bears and coyotes, cougars, a number of other smaller creatures.
Yeah,
but to the best of my knowledge, no mountain goats. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So following up on Andrew's work, indicated that, again, just focused on the Cascades, we got interested and got curious as to the extent to which the mountain goat population in the Washington Cascades was connected to the much larger populations of goats that exist in the Southern Rockies in British Columbia and also in the Coast Range of British Columbia. So my grad student Leslie Parks took on that project, and she did a bit more sampling in the Cascades, but really focused on trying to get samples extending up into Canada. And this figure shows the location of her samples, both in the Cascades and also up into British Columbia. And bottom line from her work was that, she confirmed, this is that same sort of figure that you saw before, showing the probability of encountering a mountain goat with North Cascades genetic characteristics in different areas. And so this is the North Cascades, here's the South Cascades, here's that I-90 corridor with that very steep gradient, probability gradient associated with the I-90 corridor. And you can see these other less steep, but nevertheless very significant barriers. This one's associated with the Okanagan Valley. And this barrier is mostly a result of habitat alterations in the very sort of broad, low elevation Okanagan Valley that's just not suitable for movement by goats. And then over here, we've got this gradient that indicates a barrier to movement up into the Coast Range of British Columbia. And this is associated with the Fraser lowlands, the Fraser Valley, and the very intense human development there. And both in terms of highways, but also habitat alterations, creation of habitat that's not really suitable for movement like goats. And again, although this is really focusing on, well, dealing exclusively with goats, this also should provide some insights regarding grizzly bears and the potential for grizzly bears to disperse from Canada down into the North Cascades. Could they do it? Yes, but many of the factors that create barriers to movement by mountain goats also going to create barriers to movement by grizzly bears. And so most grizzly bear biologists are pretty convinced that if we want to reestablish grizzlies in the Washington Cascades, we're going to have to bring some animals in. But moving along, these are some other results from Leslie Park's work. This is heterozygosity for mountain goats throughout her study area. And recall I showed you that graph earlier that indicated how heterozygosity can influence juvenile survival rates. You can see very low levels of heterozygosity in the South Cascades, also low levels of heterozygosity around Mount Baker. And that's a little surprising because that's one of our largest populations. But if you think about it, Mount Baker, although it's a big mountain with good habitat, it's really sort of this peninsula, if you will, of alpine habitat that sticks way, way out to the west and is somewhat isolated from the rest of the Cascades by Baker Lake and Ross Lake to the east, to the Skagit Valley to the south, and the Fraser lowlands to the north. So it's somewhat isolated, and that probably explains why the heterozygosity there is a bit low. The North Cascades has fairly low heterozygosity. Surprisingly, real low levels of heterozygosity up here just to the north of us in Canada, and then much higher levels of heterozygosity in the Coast Range of British Columbia and also in the Southern Rockies in British Columbia as well. So again, I'm really convinced that this genetic diversity is one of the factors that's slowing the recovery of goats in the Cascades. So then moving along, what can we do to restore populations in the Cascades? And that's really been our focus over the last few years. And as I said earlier, although there's been almost no hunting pressure on goats in the Cascades for over 25 years, the populations in most of the Cascades have not recovered to historic levels, and we don't really know why. There's probably a variety of factors. As I've indicated, I think genetic diversity is a big issue. I think habitat fragmentation is also an issue as well. The alterations in those valleys that extend up into the Cascades are probably making it difficult for animals to disperse. Also, once the reductions that took place, population reductions that took place as a result of hunting, means that there's big swaths of the Cascades where there aren't any goats. So if goats disperse from those pockets that we currently have, oftentimes they don't link up with any other populations, and they don't reproduce, they don't survive. So our feeling is that translocation of animals from the non-native population in the Olympics could be helpful to jumpstart the recovery and also result in an increase in genetic diversity. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, we've managed to translocate about 350 goats from the Olympics to the Cascades. And as I said, the total population in the Cascades about 3,500. So bringing in 350 animals doesn't take you from 3,500 to 10,000, but nevertheless, that's a 10% bump. And a 10% bump in just a few years is not a trivial matter. The other factor that I think is important is that the goats that are in the Olympics have very different genetic characteristics to the one that's in the Cascades. And our feeling is that they're going to be bringing in fresh blood, if you will, and that they will increase the genetic diversity in those areas into which they're being introduced. More on that in just a minute. So, as I said, here's our study area writ large. And in 1925, there was the first translocation of goats from the Southern Rockies to the Olympics. Then in 1927 or 1929, we're not quite sure, there were some goats that were brought from Southeast Alaska and released in Olympic National Park. And there were only about, the records are a little sketchy, there were only about 11 or 12 goats total from those two translocations, one from the Southern Rockies, one from Southeast Alaska. 11 or 12 animals released in the Olympics in two different episodes. Those animals, those 11 or 12 goats, spread throughout the Olympics, and by 1983 there were over 1,200, a population of over 1,200 mountain goats in the Olympics. Really remarkable how quickly those animals got established and how quickly the population really exploded. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. One is they were being introduced into really, really good habitat. And the second is that those animals that were released came from genetically very diverse and healthy populations. So they probably had really, really high genetic diversity to begin with. A bit of hybrid vigor there, if you will. And also in the Olympics, there weren't any grizzly bears, and there was no reason for cougars to go up into the alpine zone because historically there weren't any big prey animals up there. So they were introduced into great habitat with no predators, and not surprising that their populations expanded very, very rapidly. Then by the late 1980s, or really by the mid-1980s, the Park Service began to get really concerned about mountain goat populations, and specifically the impacts that they were having on alpine vegetation, and in particular, impacts that they were having on 6 or 8 species of alpine plants that are endemic to the Olympics and don't exist anywhere else. So you've got a non-native species, mountain goats, that's having an impact on rare endemic plant species. And that was cause for a lot of concern. And so the Park Service made the decision in the late 1980s to try and get the population down. So that was the first push to try to translocate goats from the Olympics to the Cascades. And there were about 150 goats that were moved from the Olympics to the Cascades in the late 1980s. Goats were also moved from the Olympics to other states in the West. Colorado got some, Montana got some, even the Dakotas got some, of all places. So they were released in different locations in the Cascades. Again, the records are a little sketchy. And so this is sort of a cartoon of we don't really know what the trajectory was from the late 1920s, but by 1983, here's where we started in the late 1920s. By 1983, we're up to about 1,200. As a result of those translocation efforts, they pushed the population down to below 500. And the population stayed pretty low and pretty stable for quite a few years. But then by the early 2000s, you can see that the population was beginning to come back up and was on a trajectory to looking like it was going to recover to 1980s levels. And so, again, those concerns about the impact of this non-native population on endemic plants came up again. And the Park Service spent a couple of years looking at the issue and trying to decide how to proceed. In 2018, following several years of review, they announced their decision to try to remove mountain goats completely from the Olympics. Current estimates about 725 goats. So starting in the fall of 2018 and extending up to this year, we had worked very, very hard to try and capture as many animals as we could and to move them from the Cascades, from the Olympics to the Cascades. 4 different rounds of capture and translocation, each lasting about 10 days to 2 weeks. And so this effort was Herculean and involved an unbelievable amount of logistics, and involved, lining up everything from porta potties to helicopters and everything in between. Lots of volunteers were involved in this effort. I wasn't involved in the capture effort in the Olympics. I was involved in the releases over here in the Cascades. But these are just a series of photographs. This is the captures in the Cascades, or excuse me, in the Olympics. They fly around in these small helicopters, shoot either tranquilizer darts or net guns to capture goats. They then immobilize the goats in the field, put on blindfolds and put them into these goofy little bags, and then fly them down to a processing area at low elevation. A whole team of veterinarians and other volunteers there to assist in processing the animals did full veterinary workup on all the animals, took blood and tissue samples, fitted not all of them, but most of them were fitted with GPS collars. And again, contributions from the tribes have been remarkable. The tribes have really come up with massive amounts of funding to help with this effort, in particular to fund the purchase of a very large number, hundreds really, of these GPS collars. And GPS collars are not cheap. They're $1,500 to $2,000 each. So after processing, the goats were sedated to some degree, loaded into these individual crates, loaded into this refrigerated truck, because all this work was being done in the late summer. And the last thing we wanted to have happen was to get this truck full of mountain goats stuck in rush hour traffic in Seattle on a 90-degree day. So hence the use of a refrigerated truck. So the capture efforts would go on all day in the Olympics. By about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd wrap things up. They then had volunteers who would drive the trucks from the Olympics over to the Cascades. We identified about a half a dozen different release areas in the Cascades. We have somebody who was sort of the supervisor for each of those locations. I was a supervisor for one of them. And so we'd get on each day that they were doing a capture, based on how many they got and what the age and sex ratio was, they'd make a decision about which release site to use. And then whoever was the manager for that site would get a phone call at 5 o'clock or so saying, okay, you're on for tomorrow. And then we had a series of volunteers lined up, get on the phone and say, okay, we're going. And I was running a site up at Tower Mountain up near Washington Pass. So I'd call my crew, we'd all jump in the car, drive up there. By the time we got rolling and got up there, it'd be dark and maybe 10 o'clock at night. We'd roll out sleeping bags, try and get a few hours of sleep. The trucks full of goats would show up around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. Again, we'd try and get some sleep, get up around 6 o'clock the next morning. And by 7 o'clock, the helicopter would show up and we'd begin the process of shuttling goats, a couple of crates at a time, up to a release site in the Alpine zone. You get a bunch of goats up there, get them all lined up. We initially tried using these snow fences to try to kind of create a chute to sort of direct the goats up to where we wanted them to go. We gave up on that after a while because the goats, in many cases, would either barrel through or jump over the fences. So we gave up on that. As I said, we had a lot of volunteers. This is one of my favorite volunteers who had someone make this shirt for him, Mountain Goat Uber, for all your goat translocation needs. And a really remarkable group of volunteers that helped out with this effort. Again, once we got all the crates full of goats up there, then the fun part was to just take the doors off and let them go. In cases where we had a nanny and a kid, we would take the kid out, and here I'm holding one of the kids, and I had it all set and ready to go, and then we'd release that kid's mom, and then I'd kind of shove the nanny in the direction, or the kid in the direction of its mom, so they'd hopefully stay together. And when you take the doors off, about most of the 2/3 of the goats maybe just come firing out of those boxes like a rocket. A few others will sort of slowly amble out because they've been in the box for 24 hours, so they're a little stiff. And some of them you actually had to reach in there and drag them out and sort of hoist them up to get them on their feet and get them moving again. And the goats these are remarkable animals, particularly the big males. So we had a couple of big males that were up over 300 pounds. So they were more than a little imposing when they came charging out of there. The overall numbers from 2018 through 2020, total of 381 goats removed from Olympic National Park. Of those, 325 were translocated to the Cascades. You can see a number of other results. A few animals went to zoos, though mostly were kids or animals that had some sort of an injury that we felt made them unsuitable for release. There were inevitably some mortalities associated with the capture and transportation. There were a handful of animals that were in such poor condition when they were captured that the decision was made simply to put the animals down, that they were unsuitable either for sending to a zoo or for release just because they were in such poor condition. A few transport mortalities and a few lethal removals. And these were animals that, one of the issues that you may or may not be familiar with is a few years ago in the Olympics on, I think it was Kahani Ridge, there were some goats that hung out near a heavily used trail and were habituated to humans, and frankly were getting kind of ornery. And the Park Service knew about this, but at the time there had never, ever been a documented case of a mountain goat attacking or harming a human in any way. And so although they had signs up saying, you know, ornery goats up here, they didn't feel it was justified to really take any actions beyond that. And tragically, again, this was 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, there was 2 or 3 people up there on a day hike, and there was a goat that was having a bad day. And long story short, the goat headbutted one of the hikers, punctured his femoral artery, and before anybody could give him any assistance, he bled out and died. It was very tragic. And so these lethal removals, these were some goats in areas that were habituated to humans and had shown indication of being kind of ornery. And so the Park Service made the decision to simply kill them rather than transport a problem animal to another location. So again, here's the overall results. 325 animals total released between 2018 and 2020 in the Cascades. Just a few results, and this is mostly work that data compiled by Rich Harris. Rich Harris is a biologist who works for Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he was really the WDFW lead on this project and did the sort of hero's effort of coordinating all of the logistics involved in doing this translocation work. So he's really the rock star leading this project. And here's some results that he's compiled. This is the releases that were done in 2019. And these are virtually all the animals we released that we translocated were released in the North Cascades for a variety of reasons. And this shows where they were released and their movements based on the GPS tags over the few weeks after they were released. And we weren't entirely surprised, but when you release goats, they tend to, they don't just, we release them in groups of, 15 or 20 at a time, but they tend not to stick together. They tend not to stay put. They just scatter like a shotgun blast, presumably because they get dropped off and they're a little loopy from the drugs, and they're looking for home. So the animals, many of them, will cover considerable distances in the first few weeks, but then gradually their movements kind of settle down and begin to look more like a resident animal, moving relatively short distances per day. The survival rates for these animals we were pretty pleased. We thought this is pretty good. Here's the survival rates based on days since release. And this is compiled, this is data from 2019, so this doesn't include animals released this summer because obviously they haven't been out there very long. And so you can see that the survival plummets kind of initially for a variety of reasons, possibly result of injuries that we didn't notice during the capture effort. Also, you drop a still somewhat groggy, somewhat drugged animal into unfamiliar terrain, and they're vulnerable to predators in those first few weeks until they figure out where all the good escape terrain is. And so the survival rates initially they don't do so well in those first few weeks after release. But then ultimately the survival rate a year later is around 80%. And this is averaged over all of the adults. And this is really not bad because for established populations, studies that have been done with established populations around the continent, annual survival rate for adults is around 94% for ages 3 to 9. And then for animals that are over the age of 9, survival rate drops to maybe 70% or so. And so, given all the, the trauma associated with the translocation, an overall survival rate of 80% we felt was pretty darn good. I mean, we would have liked for it to be higher, but we feel like that was pretty darn good. Also with kids, for established populations, kid survival, that is survival from birth to their first birthday, is typically around 60%. And we observed a survival rate of about 50% for all translocated kids, which again, not bad. Particularly, and we had some really unusual situations where, again, we went to great efforts during the shipment and during the release, we would release a kid with its nanny and make sure they, headed off together. But again, those nannies were traumatized to some degree. And so we had, these animals all radio tagged. Not all the kids, but many of the kids had radio tags. And in some cases, we could document situations where the kid got separated from its mom, but linked up with another adult female. And that other adult female at least tolerated it, and that they hung together for a year, and that kid survived. So again, this survival rate of 50% compared to 60% for established populations, we feel is pretty good. Now, reproduction, we were really eager to get some information about reproductive rates for these translocated animals. The radio tag gave us great information about movement and survival. We know when an animal dies, it stops moving and we get a mortality signal. Interestingly, those animals that were radio tagged that died, when it was practical, we tried to go in there and as soon as we could after the animal died to try and determine cause of death. But more often than not, it would take a week or two for us to get in there. And by that time, scavengers had gotten to most of the animals, and you couldn't really tell if it was a predation, if the mortality caused by predation or some other factor. So although we have good information about survival, we don't know cause of death. But to get reproductive information, the only way to get that is to get eyes on the animals. You have to have make visual contact, and a year later, the rut is in the fall, and kids are born in late May and into June. So the only way to determine if a female has reproduced is to get in there in late June or sometime in the summer and see if she's got a kid at heel. And so you gotta be able to see the animals. So in 2019, I had 4 interns working with me, 2 teams of 2 individuals each. I was able to send them out into the field for a week at a time. I had information on the GPS tagged animals, so I was able to give them a location of, okay, here's where this nanny was yesterday. Here's how I think you can get in there and go to it. But turns out knowing where the animal was yesterday is not necessarily tell you where the animal's going to be today. And oftentimes they get in there and realize the animal had moved to a location that it was simply impractical for them to get to. And so more often than not, they'd spend a week in the field trying to chase down these animals. And they had VHF receivers with directional antennas, so they could pick up signals, but making visual contact was very, very difficult. So we were trying to get information about reproductive rate and also whether those translocated goats were linking up with native goats. So it was difficult. We didn't get as much information as we wanted. We did get some very encouraging news, and that is during the summer, they were only able to get visual. This was, again, 2 teams of 2 people each spending about 6 weeks in the field. And in that entire time, they were only able to get visual contact with 8 adult females that were released in the previous September. And of those 8 females, it was very encouraging that 2 of them were observed with kids during the late summer. And that was encouraging and somewhat surprising because, again, these animals were released in September, the ruts in November. So within a month of their release, they needed to, number one, be physiologically ready to reproduce. And given the trauma associated with that movement, it wouldn't have been surprising to us if they wouldn't have been physiologically prepared. But then also they had to find a mate, which, again, in unfamiliar terrain, that might have been difficult. So we were really encouraged and pleased to be able to confirm that 2 of those 8 nannies were observed with kids during the late summer of 2019. And this is one of those nannies. And so here's just a long-range photograph of a cliff site. Here's a couple of white dots on the cliff. And this is a really lousy photograph, but this is a photograph that my interns very good at improvising in the field, because it's not like we sent them out there in the field with very heavy, high quality telephoto lenses. So this is a photograph that's taken by holding a cell phone camera up to one of the eyepieces on their spotting scope to take a photograph. So not a very good photograph, but good enough. You can see here's the adult female, and you can see she's got a collar on, and here's her kid. So we're real pleased to see that. So what's next? Well, as I said, nearly all the adults were equipped with GPS tags that could last for 2 to 3 years. So we'll continue to monitor survival and movement. We'd like to get more information about reproduction and association of translocated goats with native goats. Certainly our ground-based efforts during the summer of 2019 were not terribly productive. And so I should say during the summer of not 2020, we didn't do anything this summer because of COVID other than release some goats. But the summer of 2021, we will do helicopter surveys in an attempt to get this information about reproduction and association of translocated goats with native goats. Helicopters are really expensive, but they're actually more cost effective. I mean, sending those crews out into the field for a week at a time to maybe get a sighting of one goat is just not cost effective. With a helicopter, you can cover a lot of terrain, and in an hour of flight time, probably check up on multiple goats. So we think it's going to be a much more cost-effective way of getting that information. So what's next in Olympic National Park? Well, we've run out of money for doing translocation work, and also we've captured all the goats that are in areas that are in which it's practical, really, to try to do the capture work. The capture work it's expensive and it's also dangerous. And the remaining goats are simply in places where it's just not safe to operate. And so the park has determined that their preferred alternative is to use lethal removal to remove the remaining 350 goats, which I know is more than a little disturbing to a lot of people. There are a lot of strong feelings about this on both sides. I certainly respect those different points of view. Fall of 2020, they've just completed ground-based lethal removal using trained volunteers. Beginning in the summer of 2021, they'll fly around in helicopters and shoot goats from helicopters, which again is it's expensive, but it's a decision that the Park Service has made. And again, my focus is on the restoration of the populations in the Cascades, not on the removal of goats from Olympic National Park. I'm sure there'll be folks who have strong feelings about that. Try to answer the best I can, but again, I wasn't really involved in making that decision. I want to acknowledge the financial support we've gotten from a variety of different organizations. You can see the list of all those groups that have contributed to our work. And again, all the work that I was showing you today is work that I've contributed to, but it's work that's been carried out by a large number of individuals and that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years. So that's all I've got. I'd be happy to address any questions people might have.
So David, I've got a few questions here.
Sure.
The first question is there any way that you can induce the goats to use the new highway crossings on Interstate 90?
That's a good question. Nothing comes to mind. You know, that's one of those things where you put those crossing structures in and you hope for the best. As I said, there's been a lot of evidence that those structures are being used by a variety of different species, no evidence thus far of goats using them. Now, one issue which I didn't mention, but I should have, is we put in these really nifty crossing structures, the overpasses and the underpasses, culverts in various places, and those hopefully will improve connectivity across the highways. But at the same time they did that, they've also put in much more extensive and much more effective fencing on both sides of the highways to keep animals from crossing the highway. And as you might imagine, one of the other projects unrelated to this that I have worked on over the years is elk on Route 90 between Concrete and Cedro Woolley. That's an area where there's a lot of elk in the valley, particularly in the wintertime. A lot of elk get hit on the highway and killed on the highway. As you might imagine, if you run into an 800-pound elk at 50 miles an hour in your car, it will ruin your whole day. It's a very valid safety issue. And so the highway department wants to do everything they can to prevent animals, particularly large animals, from crossing Highway 90 and being hit by cars. So, and I get that. So at the same time, we've built these nice crossing structures. We've also put in bigger fences. So which of those two factors is going to be more important? Are those crossing structures going to increase the movement of wildlife across the I-90 corridor? Or are the fences, the improved fencing, going to make it harder for animals to get across the highway? We don't know the answer to that. It's going to take us a decade to find out which of those two factors is dominant.
Okay, so I have another question here, and that is, you didn't really show, I mean, I guess you showed from 2019, but you didn't show from 2018 and 2020 where the goats were released, you know, the other areas. And in that, you know, related to that, since the Mount Baker heterozygosity is so low, were the goats also translocated into the Mount Baker area as well?
Well, the first part of that, this figure that I showed, these are the results from 2019, but we used pretty much the same release areas in all 3 years, 2018, 19, and 20. In 2018, we only had one trapping translocation period, or 10-day to 2-week period. During 2019, we had 2 of those trapping episodes, and then 1 of them in 2020. So we used the same release areas in all 4 of those episodes spanning 3 years. And the reason we picked the North Cascades is because is a couple of reasons, but mostly these were areas that we felt had the lowest populations and could benefit the most from translocations. And also we wanted to, you know, do the translocations in places where, you know, we felt we could link up populations. We didn't want to drop goats into a place where there wasn't anything else, there weren't any other goats anywhere nearby. We wanted there to be some, you know, some goats, both native translocated goats close enough that they could link up and find a mate and reproduce. But there was another question you asked. I lost track
Well,
of it.
so there weren't any goats released into the Mount Baker area or the South Cascades or the South Cascades.
Correct. And the reason for that, number one, is Mount Baker has one of the largest populations in the state. There's about something in excess of, geez, I should remember these, but I think it's about 300 goats on Mount Baker. And so the feeling was there's plenty of goats there. Now you're right, the genetic diversity there is low, but the population size was pretty large. So the feeling was we didn't need to release any goats there. Now, the other thing which I failed to mention is that one of the interesting results from Andrew Shirk's work, the first student I had who did genetic work, is yes, we could confirm what we suspected from the outset, that the native Cascade goats were genetically very different than the Olympic goats. But and we knew that there were some goats that were moved from the Olympics to the Cascades in the 1980s. And we did some sampling. Some of the samples that we collected in the Cascades came from the vicinity of some of the release sites, the sites where Olympic goats were released in the 1980s. And you know what? We could detect the genetic signature of those goats, of those translocated goats. We could see some evidence that those goats released in the 1980s survived and interbred with native Cascade goats, and we could see some hybrids, if you will. And in those locations, there was this sort of local pocket of somewhat higher genetic diversity, which again encourages us to think that, you know, what we've done over the last 3 years here will bump up genetic diversity around those release sites. And that's something that, you know, it's going to take another decade or two to really pick that up.
So have there been, another question we have is, have there been other translocation of animals to promote genetic diversity that you know of? I know there's some, you know, there certainly has been relocation of animals to start populations in areas, but as far as promoting genetic diversity?
Not so much with goats, but there's a famous example that's in all the conservation biology textbooks. And I'm not going to remember the details right now, but it was I want to say it was with some sort of one of the some sort of a ground nesting bird, sort of a prairie chicken or something like that. I can't remember, ruffed grouse or something. And in Ohio or Illinois or someplace like that, and the local populations were really, really low. Reproductive success was really, really low. They did some genetic work and were able to compare genetic diversity of those low populations with genetic material that was in museums that had been collected, you know, decades ago. We're able to confirm that genetic diversity was very, very low. And they were able to collect some individuals from large, healthy populations elsewhere in other states, brought them in, released them, and over a period of just a few years, they were able to see dramatic increases in local genetic diversity and dramatic increases in reproductive success. And that's sort of a classic example that's in all the conservation biology textbooks. Again, I'm sorry, I can't remember all the details on that. So that's the best example that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have two people that they raised their hands, but they didn't put their questions into chat. So, well, Mary Patterson and then a Rosemary. I think I unmuted you. So do you have questions that you can ask directly? See if they're still here. I think I unmuted them. But I'm not getting a response. So so anyway, then I just had a comment here. I had a comment that Colleen Shannon just mentioned that on September 8th, they were lucky enough to see let's see, a nanny and a kid just west of Cascade Pass, next to the trail.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so that's always a nice thing to be able to see.
Yeah, it's always great. Yeah, and I'll tell you that my, go-to area if I want to go, if I have some out-of-town guests and I want to show them mountain goats, my most reliable place and easiest place to go see mountain goats is up near Coleman Pinnacle. If you just go up to Artist Point in the summertime and head out the trail towards Coleman Pinnacle, you get out there, and I've never been skunked. There's never been a time that I've gone out there that I haven't seen goats.
Coleman Pinnacle.
Yeah, so there's a trail from Artist Point that heads out, and sometimes you can be lucky enough to see them from the parking lot there at Artist Point. But again, my sort of best spot where you're right in the middle of mountain goat country is if you keep going out that trail, about 4 miles. There's a trail that goes out, goes under Coleman Pinnacle, and heads up to one of the glaciers. I can't remember, but you get out into that area, and there's a band of, I don't know, probably 50 to 80 goats in that area. So you're almost certain to see goats out there. And the nice thing there is you start at Artist Point, so you're starting out at 5,000 feet, and that trail out 4 miles, it goes up and down a little bit, but it's not like you have to climb 1,000 feet to get into mountain goat country.
Is that the end of that's Ptarmigan Ridge Trail, right?
Yeah, the Ptarmigan Ridge Trail. Yeah.
Right. Every time I have always seen mountain goats when I go out that trail.
Yeah, great place to see them.
Although sometimes I have to admit that sometimes they look like a rock on a snowfield, but they're actually mountain goats cooling off on a snowfield.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you can be fooled.
Yeah.
I think, let's see, I think I have another question here. Mary or Rosemary, did you have a question? Yeah, if you can unmute, let's see, I don't know. I'm not getting a response.
Our question was answered.
Okay. Okay, great. I have a couple more questions here. Let's see. Sure. If I can get to it. Let's see. What kind of, I know you had lots of volunteers. So what kind of citizen scientists, I mean, was this basically considered, I mean, were these sort of citizen scientists or is there any opportunity for citizen scientists to get involved in, or community scientists to get involved in this sort of work with the mountain goats as far as keeping track of mountain goats, or is that a little bit arduous?
Well, it's very arduous, yeah. For the translocation work, there were tons of volunteers that were involved, that were helped out with that work. Particularly, I mean, just drivers, driving those refrigerated trucks over from the Olympics to the Cascades in the middle of the night took a lot of people, and helping out both at the capture site, just with the logistics, and helping out at the release sites. Again, my participation was at the release sites, and at those release sites, you get these big crates full of, with mountain goats in them, and we had to horse them out of the truck and then get them over into positions that a helicopter could, we get them rigged up in slings so that the helicopter could fly them out of there. So there was a lot of participation in that regard. The work that I've done over the years, it's been exclusively with students, although I have done, back when we were doing some of the genetic work, I mentioned, where do we get genetic samples? Well, a lot of it, as I said, came from blood and tissue samples from animals that we captured for radio tagging and other efforts. But actually, most of Leslie Park's work, we relied on another source of genetic material, which is considerably less glamorous, and that is mountain goat poop. It turns out that you can collect mountain goat pellets, and then you can swab the outside of those pellets with basically Q-tips, and there's genetic material on the outside of those pellets, and we could use that as a source of genetic information. So we did have participation from climbers and hikers that were going into mountain goat habitat. We'd give them these little kits, a little Tupperware container with all the collection material they needed. they GPS the location where they collected the samples and get them to us. And so that was one way that, you know, people other than students were helping out. In, you know, those interns that I had summer 2019, that was work that, number one, it was arduous, and number two, it was very equipment intensive in the sense that all those interns, the teams had GPS receivers, which everybody's got a GPS unit, but they also had VHF telemetry receivers to pick up signals from radio tag goats and directional antennas. And you know, we only have so many of those units. So getting citizen scientists involved in doing that observation work just doesn't seem practical, because, you know, if I gave you a map of here's where the goats were yesterday, that's not terribly useful, because today and the next day they're going to be many kilometers away. And so it just strikes me as wouldn't be very efficient, wouldn't be very successful in making observations. And, you know, if you go out there and, you know, people are quite likely, if they go out into the right locations and they're lucky, they might see one of our radio tagged animals, but unless you have a receiver, you're not going to be able to tell us which one of those animals it was. And so telling us that you saw a goat with a radio tag, okay, that narrows it down to one of 300 animals, but that doesn't get us very far. So there may be opportunities in the future, but right now I'm not seeing a lot of opportunities for citizen science, but that's always something that I'm looking for. I know there are a lot of other scientists at Western that are able to involve citizens in their work, but this stuff, not so much.
Okay, David. If we could see your face again, it'd be great.
Sure.
And
yeah, well, just one other thing before I unshare my screen is I'll give you, if you're interested, here's my webpage. You can see here's the link up here, faculty.wwu.edu/Wallin, my last name. And here you can see some more information about me, current research and publications. There's a number of publications, both master's theses as well as journal articles that you can download here if you're so inclined. And with that, I'll let you see my face again.
Okay, I really wanted to thank you so much. I had a couple of participants in the audience that also wanted to thank you. They thought it was incredibly enlightening and well done, and they really appreciated the presentation. And I'm looking forward to seeing if all the work, I mean, it's an incredible amount of work, and I'm looking forward to seeing if it really comes to fruition as far as the increasing the population and the genetics of those mountain goats. And we'll have to see, right? It'll take many years.
Yes. Well, it's been a pleasure. I always enjoy opportunity to share this with a broader audience. So appreciate the invitation. I hope you'll invite me back some other time. And
okay.
Yeah, this has been, like I said, the longest term project I've had in my career. It's been a real privilege to be involved in it. And I've had the opportunity to work with just a huge number of really talented individuals across many different agencies. It's been a pleasure to work with the tribes. Again, if it wasn't for the Swaddle Indian tribe, none of this would have happened. They were the group that really pushed us all to start looking at mountain goats and trying to figure out, you know, what's going on with them, why the population was in decline.
Okay, well, that's wonderful, and thanks again. I really appreciate you coming and presenting to us, and I also appreciate all of the attendees coming tonight and devoting their time to listening to you. So I guess with that, we'll conclude tonight's membership meeting. And again, November 17th is the next meeting. So go to the website, go to the North Cascade Audubon website, and you can find the link to that presentation, as well as at the Whatcom Museum website. You can find that presentation listed as well. And that's November 17th with Jonathan Fellis. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.